Welcome to the third History of University Life seminar for 2020. My name is Julia Horne and I'm Associate Professor in the Department of History at the University of Sydney and also co-convenor of History of University Life. My other co-convenors are Matthew Thomas and Derek Schroeder. First and foremost, I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land we broadcast today and pay respect to Gadigal elders past, present and future. It's upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built. So as we share our knowledge and research practices today, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. Now, our seminar today examines whether the humanities and social sciences can survive COVID. That's, of course, a brutal and possibly unfair question, but it does, I think, feel as though we are now at a critical juncture. In June, the Commonwealth Education Minister, Dan Tehan, who we know has 3 social science degrees, including 2 at the postgraduate level, announced a swag of reforms in higher education intended to make university graduates job ready. Most people will know these changes include more expensive arts degrees. In fact, at double their current rate, they'll be significantly more expensive. And the reason? To shift enrolment demand away from arts degrees and into what the Minister describes as job-ready degrees. But aren't arts degrees already job-ready? Should governments actually determine what type of graduate will future-proof our economic well-being? Or should we leave that conundrum perhaps to students and employers, who both tend to have a reasonable nose for these sorts of matters? And if, God forbid, the humanities and social sciences were to wither away, untended in our universities, what would that actually mean for Australia in social, cultural and economic terms, or what politicians seem to love calling the national interest? So to answer these and other questions, we have 3 experts today from different disciplinary perspectives. You think I could actually say the word disciplinary? Anyway, first is Michael Goodman, who's joined us from New Zealand. Michael is currently a PhD history candidate at the University of Sydney, but he's also had a successful career of promoting the humanities and the social sciences in the United States, including as the Associate Director of the Centre for the Humanities at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Director of Programs at the Wisconsin Academy of Science, Arts and Letters. Next will be Joy Damousi, who has joined us from Melbourne. Joy is Professor of History and Director of the newly established Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Australian Catholic University. She's also a highly acclaimed historian of modern Australia and as a consequence is the author of, in fact, many books. So I've asked Joy to join us today as the current President of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. And finally, joining me in the studio in Sydney is Jane Hall. Jane is Distinguished Professor of Health Economics at UTS and has an enviable national and international reputation as a health economist, to the extent that in 2016, the Australian Financial Review and Westpac proclaimed her as one of 100 women of influence. So I've asked Jane to join us today as the current President of the Australian Academy of the Social Sciences. Now, there's much to get through in the next 55 minutes or so. As usual, we'll begin with presentations with the final 10 to 15 minutes of the session devoted to your questions. So I do encourage you now, as you hear the presentations, to jot down your questions ready to post via the webinar Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So now to the presentations and our speakers. First is Michael Goodman, who's currently researching the history of humanities as a foundational idea in mid-20th century universities. And I've asked him to draw on this idea to provide some interesting historical and contextual background to our discussion today. So now to Michael from across the ditch.
Thank you, Julia. Tehan's divisive funding proposal for universities is not the first time that a nation has responded to economic and social upheavals by prioritizing specific occupational categories in university instruction. I will speak about two examples of such interventions in Australia. First, by a Labour cabinet minister to meet wartime manpower needs, and then a decade after the war, by the Liberal Party government to expand the university system following the recommendations of the Murray Committee's 1957 report. These cases demonstrate how national policymaking in regards to universities became more centralized as a consequence of the war and, significant for our debate today, how the prioritizing of technological education after the war to meet the needs of a changing economy did not demand the subordination of the humanities. In fact, quite the opposite. The first intervention I will recount took place in the midst of World War II. The roots of Australian Commonwealth funding for universities began as provisional measures to prioritize specific fields of study to meet immediate wartime needs. In January 1942, the Labour government's Minister for War Organization of Industry, John Dedman, called a conference between his department and universities. Held at the University of Melbourne, this meeting was attended by the Australian Vice-Chancellor's committee members, as well as representatives from the Department of War, the Army, the Technical Training Division of the Department of Labor and National Service, and the Manpower Priorities Board. Slide 1, please. Dedman told those in attendance that wartime necessitated that some of the core tenets of university independence were suspended. Universities must be willing to do untraditional things, he announced. This included changing the composition and management of research activities to meet wartime needs, changing the courses of study offered, and, most critically, adopting new entry requirements and restrictions on the number of students enrolling in selected courses of study. This last item was already a significant issue in 1942. Governments had previously established reserve courses that protected some students from being called up into service while at university. These selected courses were considered essential to the wartime effort. They included physics, chemistry, medicine, metallurgy, engineering, bacteriology, biochemistry, geology, botany, and agriculture. An unintended consequence, however, was that a far larger number of students enrolled in reserve courses in order to avoid military service, using these courses as havens of refuge. University resources were unable to meet this increased atypical demand. Responding to this situation, the government created quotas for the reserve courses based on merit as decided by individual universities. This new government quota scheme in turn provoked a successful constitutional challenge of the Commonwealth powers to direct university policies. Slide 2, please. In the 1943 High Court of Australia decision in The King against the University of Sydney, the court ruled against the Commonwealth's ability to regulate admission to specific university courses. Even given the expansive wartime powers of the government, the quotas went beyond what the High Court deemed to be constitutional, declaring, Regulation 16 of the National Security Regulations, purporting to make provision for the control of admission to universities, is not within the defense power of the Commonwealth and is invalid. According to Justice Rich, it is outside the power of the Commonwealth Parliament to exercise general control of education in the schools or universities of Australia, to prescribe the method of qualification for entrance, discriminate between faculties and restrict the number of students to be admitted to or enrolled in any faculty, determine the course of study and curricula in the various faculties of the university, the nature and subjects of examinations, and set the standards for passing the examinations. While the end of the war brought to a close the Commonwealth's wartime powers to control university admissions, tertiary education in Australia would not return to its status prior to wartime, when it was fundamentally a concern of the states. Realizing the important role universities would play in post-war reconstruction, and in the training and research required as part of its vision for Australia's role in the new global economy, the Commonwealth retained much of the institutional infrastructure connected to its wartime educational efforts. On 26 July 1945, only weeks away from the official end of the war, Dedman, now Minister for Post-War Reconstruction, announced the government's post-war policy for higher education in Australia. It retained the recently established Universities Commission, set up the Commonwealth Office of Education, which would house the Commission, and committed to the establishment of the Australian National University in Canberra. Grants would continue to go to universities, at least in the short term, for facilities and other expenses to support the Commonwealth Reconstruction Training Scheme. But the Commonwealth's expansion in higher education provision was still quite limited. Universities and state governments were lobbying for far greater Commonwealth financial support for the underfunded and overstretched universities in the post-war period. The second intervention in 1957 was under the leadership of the Menzies Liberal government. The recommendations of the report of the Committee on Australian Universities, known as the Murray Report, would radically rewrite the higher education system throughout Australia. One of the committee's key goals was to respond to the pressing need for greater tertiary technological education, citing the severe shortage of graduates and meeting industrial demand, and noting, for example, that in Melbourne alone, the industrial demand in 1956 for graduates in engineering, chemistry, and physics exceeded by 9 to 15 times the supply. The Murray Report decisively highlighted the role of technology for Australia's future, noting the, quote, vital importance of science and technology to the life and progress not only of industry but of the nation. As compared to the science and technology education growth in the United States and the United Kingdom, there was great concern that Australia was falling far behind, and leaving the choice of study up to students, the committee contended, had failed to meet the current needs of industry. Quote, there's little sign that a greater proportion of the able young men of today are turning towards the pure and applied sciences in the choice of their careers than was the case in the generation before the war. The responsibility for solving this problem, the committee continued, rested upon the government and Australian universities, amongst other institutions. Quote, it is difficult to resist the conclusion that some such diversion in the flow of talent is necessary. We believe that active steps to do this should be taken without avoidable delay by governments, universities, industries, and schools. Still, even with the explicit priority for technological education and the need for diversion in the flow of talent, which sounds familiar to us today, the authors of the Murray Report also made clear that there would be an important role for the humanities. These were not mutually exclusive efforts. Wartime had highlighted the importance of technology for the post-war world economy, but wartime and the lessons of fascism had also stressed the importance of a broadly educated and critical citizenship, as well as the importance of academic and university independence. Slide 3, please. As the report put it, quote, it is becoming more and more clearly and widely recognized in recent years that the world simply cannot afford that its highly specialized professional men, technologists, and scientists should not be fully educated as rounded human beings. Many of the most serious problems in the world today are moral problems and are problems of human relationships. The need for the study of the humanities is therefore greater and not less than in the past. In his introduction to the 1957 bill that would enact the recommendations of the Murray Report, Prime Minister Robert Menzies further highlighted the value of that the humanities had as part of the new attention to the role of universities for Australia. Slide 4, please. Speaking to the House of Representatives, Menzies stated, I hope that we will not, under current pressures of emotions, be tempted to ignore the basic fact that civilization in the true sense requires a close and growing attention not only to science in all its branches, but also to those studies of the mind and spirit of man, of history and literature and language, and mental and moral philosophy, of human relations in society and industry, of international understanding, the relative neglect of which has left a gruesome mark on this century. Let us have more scientists and more humanists. Let the scientists be touched and informed by the humanities. Let the humanists be touched and informed by science. These interventions by governments into the realm of universities, most notably during times of disruption, demonstrated the changing role of universities in the 20th century, especially underscoring a new role for them in the economic welfare of nations. They also highlighted shifting boundaries of university independence and the more traditional understandings of the idea of the university and its role in cultivating fully rounded human beings. Thank you.
So thank you, Michael, very much for that really illuminating discussion and providing some historical context for when governments actually understood the notion of a university-led recovery and wanted that to happen. What I would like to actually ask you before we move along is that in this period, you know, as you show, technology was seen as a cure for catastrophe and also as the means to recovery. Yet I think it's so interesting that the ideal university graduate at this time is being seen as a humanised technocrat. I mean, the notion of a humanised technocrat's not really relevant perhaps to today. So I just wonder if you could say why it is in the mid-20th century that that's occurring. You know, why were technocrats in some ways feared that they had to be humanised, even as they were also seen as a really necessary part of post-war recovery?
I mean, I think you have to go to
there were several issues, as I think I suggested in the presentation. The humanities had been, the sort of crisis of the humanities and this question of the humanities in the universities had been around really as sort of a mid-19th century question. And that sort of the humanities became an outgrowth of early introductions of science and math, and then later on in technology, where the humanities became a proxy for protecting the traditional idea of the university and the idea of sort of unfettered, pure research, this Humboldtian idea of what the university was. I think with the example of the rise of Nazism, but even earlier this came into question, you saw a fragility of the university idea, that the independent university could be overthrown. In Germany, there was a prime example, and I think it shook a lot of people that it was these institutions that people thought were permanent to some degree were easily shifted into complete national control, no academic freedom whatsoever. So the humanities took on this sort of protector role again that people began to see even in the 30s. In my work, I can just do a quick quote. There's a quote from an author from 1934 who says, "When we remember what has happened to the German universities and realize how these once famous centers of learning and free research have been converted into agencies of propaganda for a political party that equates itself with the nation and tolerates no dissenters, we may well be concerned to keep alive in our institutions the spirit of humanities, the only efficacious antidote to a narrow nationalism of cultural isolationism." So as you suggest in your question, I think there are these tensions of needing technology and really promoting higher education, technology in higher education, and at the same time worrying about the effects of technology. Again, you see this in the United States after the atomic bomb. The response to the United States version of the Murray Report, the Truman Report, specifically says we have gotten ahead of ourselves. Technology has gotten ahead of our ability as humans to manage and negotiate what it can do. So the humanities again are referenced as a protector of the outgrowth of technology that speeds ahead of humans' ability to manage it. So you see the humanities in that dual role, I think, as protecting the idea of the university and ameliorating these dangerous effects of technology. Another quick example I can give is in New South Wales in 1940, the Minister of Education, David Drummond, who was promoting his Technology Education Act, specifically referenced Germany and Japan as great leaders in technological education, and that Australia should move in the direction they had done. But by 1945, in a similar discussion in the New South Wales Parliament, Drummond talks about the soulless technician and the dangers of education without a broader understanding of society. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
oh no, that's fantastic, and it's just really amazing, very, very interesting indeed. So we're now going to move away from you, but I don't want you to go away because you're to return in our Q&A discussion. Our next presentation is by Joy Damousi, who I've asked to speak about the details of the Academy of the Humanities submission to the Senate Committee on the Job Ready Graduates Bill for what it tells us about the humanities disciplines in the 21st century. It's actually a really interesting submission, and it's available. You can go to the Academy of Humanities website and download it and read it, and I'd really actually recommend you do that. But we have Joy today talking to us about humanities and its importance to the way forward, I guess. We keep talking about roads to recovery. So let's cross now, in fact, across several closed borders, I think, to get to Joy in Victoria. And welcome, Joy.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. It's a great privilege. I would like to first begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of all the lands on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Our slogan in the Academy of the Humanities is Humanising the Future. Underlying all the work the Academy has done this year has been to highlight the cultural, ethical, historical and social expertise required to understand current situations and crises, but also moving forward into the post-COVID world to grasp the processes and complexities of rebuilding our lives and communities into the future. At the heart of the challenges of this year has been a great paradox. In a strange way, for despite the transformation of our lives, this has also, on the other hand, created a platform from the perspectives of the humanities and the social sciences to be heard. Maybe it takes a crisis for policymakers to fully appreciate the fundamental importance of a human-centred critique and understanding of the short, medium and long-term impact of crises and tragedies in our societies and communities. But as we know, this does not always translate into an appreciation of the humanities. I want to, however, first begin with a story, a positive one, of the recognition of what the humanities can offer this year. The Academy was called upon to make a significant contribution to the government's response to the COVID pandemic through its involvement in the Rapid Research Information Forum, or RIF, an initiative by the Chief Scientist involving all the academies, the Chief Scientists and other organisations, indeed a perfect example of science and humanities collaboration. The Humanities Academy brought a distinctive cultural and social perspective and much needed human-focused analysis of the impact of COVID through questions posed by the government. RIF looks like it will continue into the future in some form, so it will hopefully continue to inform government responses beyond COVID. But it seems that this recognition has been lost in the government's recent Job Ready Graduates legislation, which proposes introducing a significant price differential in the fees between university science and humanities subjects, resulting in the cost of undertaking subjects under society and culture increasing by 113% to $14,500 per year. For the remainder of the talk, I want to take some time to outline 4 points against the TN reforms, which also take us to the heart of our theme of can the humanities survive the COVID crisis. First, the underlying questions of the TN reforms are which disciplines count as being in the national interest and which are significant in shaping Australia's social and economic future, and which graduates are indeed job ready. By making it considerably cheaper to take science subjects and so encouraging students to do so, it is clear that the humanities skill set of analysis, critical thinking, creativity, complex problem solving and emotional intelligence are not deemed valuable, vital or essential to a workforce. Further, graduate outcomes data clearly shows that humanities graduates have equalled or outperformed science graduates in full-time employment and labour force participation in the past 3 years, and that humanities graduates contribute significantly to the Australian economy in a range of industries. For example, despite perceptions about the dominance of the mining sector, healthcare and social services are in fact the major employers in regional Australia, and in regional Queensland, for example, creative industries are bigger employers than both mining and agriculture. Research from the Regional Australian Institute found that access to arts and cultural activities and infrastructure are a significant factor in families deciding to relocate and live there. The Regional Australian Institute further identifies the creative industries as one of the 4 sectors which are key for the economic future of regional Australia. A 2019 report from the government's own Bureau of Communications and Arts Research, Creative Skills for the Future Economy, provides a rich analysis of the opportunities for creative skills across the Australian economy in and beyond the culture and creative sector. More significantly, and this gets to the question of the future and beyond COVID, with automation and artificial intelligence upon us, it will be humanities trained graduates that will bring capacities and capabilities that cannot be automated, such as critical thinking, analytical understanding, communication and problem solving. Suggesting that humanities is less useful for future employment flies in the face of what employers have told us about the value of an arts degree to their organisations and their businesses, and what they have said on the public record of its intrinsic worth. Second, the changes proposed reflect an extremely outdated model of education where science and humanities are seen as separate. An interdependent and interconnected relationship between the science and the humanities are vital in this digital global world now and into the future. The resources sector, for example, currently contributes around 8.5% of Australia's GDP. This sector relies on archaeologists and anthropologists trained in society and culture fields to undertake cultural heritage and ethnographic surveys ahead of mine development. 55% of professional archaeologists are employed in the private sector, undertaking cultural heritage work, and these roles have expanded over the past 2 decades to service the expanding resources sector. 97.4% of professional archaeologists had a minimum qualification of a past degree in society and culture. Similarly, the Native Title Anthropologist Grant Program, funded by the Attorney General's Department, seeks to fill the skills gap of anthropologists able to support the resolution and management of native title, again, key to our economic future. Third, the inequities in the proposals need to be highlighted, and there are many. We can point to the gender inequities because it remains the case that STEM is a male-dominated field and the humanities are female-dominated, so a heavier cost will be carried by women undertaking the humanities. Students from low socioeconomic backgrounds will also be negatively affected, especially those from the regional areas. And for those in this group, access to studying culture and society will be limited. Indeed, it will be more costly to study Indigenous history than medicine. A capacity to pay should also never determine subject choices. Passion and talent has in the past influenced student choice and should continue to do so. And finally, universities aspire to deliver a world-class education and training in the 21st century. As we move through this uncertain century, educating our citizens in a broad and wide knowledge of culture and the humanities will be vital to understanding Australia's place in a rapidly shifting global world, but also to comprehend the specifics of Australia's history and culture, of Australia's First Nations peoples, and to provide a human-centred response to the major social, cultural and environmental challenges of our time. This humanity-centred education is essential as we face the challenges of an unfolding, uncertain century where humanising the future will form the bedrock of our society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joy. And, I think the report is just so interesting in what it tells us about what arts graduates are doing and how they are job ready. And, that whole question about arts graduates being job ready or being a central part of the economy in regional Australia, I think is really fascinating. But I want to actually follow up on your presentation with a different sort of question. Of course, the Academy of Humanities and your role as president, you're very well placed to talk to politicians. So I'd actually like to ask you about the task of persuading Australian politicians on the importance of humanities. So, what arguments actually matter to government, in your opinion, and what do you do to be heard?
That's a great question, Julia. I'll do my best to answer it. Well, I suppose more immediately, the Academy's tried to put forward their arguments and the arguments in our submission on a number of levels, and I think we go in with all cylinders firing, but not just in one concentrated area. So, for example, we would and have written to the Minister Tehan, and to many of the senators who are involved in this debate and in the vote. So there's the old-fashioned way of writing to ministers, social media, lobbying through social media in a whole range of ways. Of course, we were there at the Senate committee discussion last week and responded to questions from senators around our submission. I think, the usual op-ed pieces and other forms of lobbying are ways in which we have tried as an academy to make these perspectives heard. It's very tricky because, we want to be part of the democratic process, but we also have to manage our expectations about how politicians work, what agendas drive them, what agendas drive universities. And you would have heard through the Senate inquiry or the Senate submissions, while some universities are very critical of the legislation, some of them have approved or are happy to for the legislation to go forward in the interests of certainty in the sector. So people come from different perspectives on this legislation. I think one of the key things our submission, I hope, does is something you've just highlighted there, Julia, and that is we've drawn on studies, examples, reports that might not be familiar to people around the place of humanities graduates. We know the percentages, but some of the examples I mentioned in that talk were lifted from the submission. And I think one of the values that I think we bring to this debate is to highlight some of these examples that people might not be familiar with, the contribution in the heritage area, the contribution to environmental studies, all undertaken by humanities graduates. The bushfire contribution we made there to the Royal Commission, again, around the human-centred analysis of engaging with disasters. They might not immediately come to mind to politicians. So I think some of the contributions we've made is to make those examples, those case studies available to politicians, to highlight them, to talk also about a student-centred approach to this debate, and particularly high school students, and how the speed in which this legislation is being put forward is detrimental to students' planning at years 11 and 12. And I guess to sum up, it's to say that we're in a very privileged position of not needing to juggle some of the demands universities need to juggle, and to really put the argument forward for the humanities in ways that might not be available to universities or other bodies, actually, that we can. So I see our contribution very much not only in the arguments we can put to politicians, but the evidence-based arguments, that there's evidence out there that we're trying to marshal to put the case forward.
Okay, yeah. So thank you very much for that. And don't go away either, because we're going to come back for some Q&A. But I want to now turn to Jane Hall, who is actually with me in the studio in Sydney. I'll just turn around so I can face you.
I'm not sure how much we're supposed to look at each other and how much we're supposed to be staring over there at the cameras.
A bit of both, I think. So welcome anyway. It's just a pleasure to welcome you to the University of Sydney and to our little studio here. I think I'd like to actually begin by asking you to define what social sciences are to you.
Certainly. The social sciences are the sciences that teach us about ourselves, how we behave, how we relate to others, and about the society in which we live in, the interrelationships, the structures that we build, the institutions that we build. I can rattle off a list of different disciplines if you'd like that.
I think it's good. Yes, I think it's good for the audience to hear, because there may be some surprises there.
Yes. Well, I guess one of the surprises is actually that the business disciplines, all the business school disciplines are in there. So economics, accounting, management, marketing, probably forgotten something. But then what we might think of as the more traditional disciplines of anthropology, sociology, behavioural science, law is a very important part of our remit, of our scope. Political science, history is there. And yes, I can get my list out if you'd like a check, but that's probably the sort of range of disciplines. So it's multifaceted. And I think one of the problems talking about STEM and talking about humanities and social sciences is that people forget that a lot of the sciences and that systematic inquiry use mathematics. So one of my great friends is a statistician, but in her spare time at the moment she's working on a quantitative analysis of Old Irish language. Mm-hmm. So there's this crossover, and it doesn't make sense to say some things are very mathematical and quantitative and then the rest of you are all soft.
Yeah, that's a lovely example, that last one, yeah. So are there some particular examples that you like to use to persuade the even most hardened sceptic? I think we've all come across them, those people who say social scientist or historian, or perhaps not economist, but, really?
Well, the first question, of course, you ask them is, what degrees have you got? And you quoted Dan Tehan, but 2/3 of our politicians have social science degrees. 2/3 of our top CEOs have social science degrees. 2/3 of our top public servants have social science degrees. So, what's so irrelevant about that? The other thing I think is to say that in the modern world, the sort of hard sciences and technology get us so far, but then the problems are going to be understood and addressed by the social sciences. So I can take any one of a number of examples, but let's take the fish kill in the Murray-Darling River. And this sticks in my mind because it was early on in my presidency. And there was all this fuss about why did the fish die? Well, the fish died because there wasn't enough water and there wasn't enough oxygen in the water. That's not actually rocket science, or maybe it is rocket science, and even rocket science isn't that hard. But the real issue, the fundamental issue, is what's wrong with the governance of our water system that allows that to happen? What's wrong with the market structures and the incentives that allows that to happen?
Is there also some, in our greatest economic and health crisis our greatest health crisis for 100 years in some ways, but our greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression. So is there a sense in which you like to marshal the social sciences to say, without the social sciences, we can't address these issues?
Oh, absolutely. So we're starting to learn more about the COVID virus, and we're learning more about how to manage that and reduce infections. But the issue now is, how do we live with that but bring back a social life and an economic life? Now, it's important that we do not think that the economy rules everything. Remember, the economy is a social institution that exists to serve humanity, not the other way around. But really what we need to do now is think about not just what are the sheer immediate medical effects, but there are long-term health effects, there are long-term issues around economic recovery, and my passion is the long-term effects on young people, whether they're starting education or they're finishing their education and trying to move into the job market. We know that it is so easy for them to be disadvantaged in terms of their long-term employment prospects, their long-term careers, and there are lots of things we can do about that, and that's where the social sciences can address that and build solutions.
So true, so true. I would also like to ask you the sort of question that I asked Joy about talking to Australian politicians about the importance of the social sciences. So are there particular arguments that you think really matter to the government or to politicians now, or in the last 10 years, say? And but perhaps also especially in the current context of COVID. So it's something that makes them stop and listen to you.
Well, economics makes them stop and listen because they're always worried about that. Political science can make them stop and listen because they're all worried about being re-elected. I mean, that's what they're going to do. We, as an academy, started last year a Parliamentary Friends of the Social Sciences, and we had a really fantastic turn-up. We had a morning meeting, breakfast meeting in Parliament House. There was standing room only in the location in which we were meeting. We had a Liberal MP, a Labor MP and a Greens MP addressed the meeting, and they gave some fantastic examples about why the social sciences were important and what they meant to them. Unfortunately, this year, of course, we haven't been able to repeat that, but there are ways, and 2/3 of those politicians have social science degrees. They know what it's about, but it is about helping them see it in, I think, the broader context.
So a major catastrophe, of course, facing humanities is climate change. Also water management is in Australia and other parts of the world, as you mentioned. So is there a way in which the social sciences can, is there a place for the social sciences in a crisis like climate change? Because we just often see it as science. It's for the scientists, they make the arguments, but can we now go beyond that?
Yes, indeed, the Academy of Social Sciences has taken on climate change as a major issue to work on over the next few years. So So yes, the issue is no longer about the science. I think most people would agree that the science is the scientific verdict is in. What we need to know is what to do about it and how to do it. And that's going to be through economic markets, it's going to be through various structures, but it's also going to be by understanding communication, understanding marketing, understanding social psychology, about how do we bring along the constituency, how do we bring along the electorate, because that's what politicians will respond to.
Now, the Academy of the Social Sciences, like the Academy of the Humanities, also prepared a submission for the Senate Committee, which is available on the Academy of Social Sciences website. And in that, the submission signed by you, so...
Yes, so you think I know what's in it.
That's right. But it did address two key issues, or two key flaws actually in the bill. The first, of course, we've spoken about with Joy, which is that social science degrees don't lead to good employment outcomes. So there's evidence to show that that's actually wrong. But secondly, that the use of price signals, so the fact that an arts degree now is more than twice as much as it is now, it will be more than twice as much next year as it is now, that those price signals the government hopes will shift and shape the course enrolments of the future. So I wonder if you could perhaps just explain to our virtual audience that particular issue about price signals and why that's a flawed assumption.
Yes, there are two parts to the flaw in that argument. So the first is that price signals will work to direct students. And what we've seen in the past is very little price elasticity, so very little response to price signals. It does seem that most students choose their degrees on the basis of aptitude, interest, and so on, as the others have said. So the price signals are unlikely to work to direct students. And because of the HECS, Higher Education Contribution Scheme, those price signals, the price you pay is going to be felt much further in the future, and it's contingent on your income anyway. So it's not a very strong price signal. I do think it's a signal, though, about we don't value these areas of scholarship, and I think that's a worry. The other is that it introduces quite perverse incentives for universities, because universities, the arts and humanities, social sciences subjects cost less to teach than a lot of the technical and scientific subjects. So universities will receive less revenue for those students and relatively more for arts students. Maybe they'll just expand their social science, humanities, arts intake, and the government ends up with exactly what it didn't want. So I think what this shows is that there's been very poor thinking through of what this policy is supposed to achieve. We haven't seen any modelling. I don't know if there's some deep in the Department of Education or Treasury, but we haven't seen any. And on those sort of a priori grounds, it would seem that it may well achieve exactly the opposite of what they're trying to do.
Yes, amazing. Well, I actually have my phone here with all the questions coming through, which has been vibrating next to me. So we might actually now bring in both Joy and Michael, along with Jane and myself, and start looking at some questions. Let me see, there are quite a lot here. We will start with one inspired by Michael's talk. And this question is asking, can we theorise? So since the government, so the example that Michael had, promoted humanities as something that was crucial if we were to have a technocracy, can we theorise that in fact government's propensity to embrace the humanities ebbs and flows in part according to the strength of their economies? I feel as though, because you're the economist, I feel as though you need to answer this.
Shouldn't it be a historian?
Well, we can. Who wants to ask this first? Would you like to just say briefly yes or no to that theory?
I must say I haven't looked at this, so I'm not sure. But I would think that I suspect that government's enthusiasm for universities and for social science, arts and humanities probably varies more with their ideology than the economic cycle.
So Michael, since it was in response to your paper, what would you like to add?
I would take quickly the opposite side. I mean, of the several, I'm not getting up to, my work ends sort of in the 50s, early 60s. But I mean, I think starting in the 19th century, you see government interventions, certainly to universities during economic hardship. And those definitely are interventions that seem to side more with practical applications of what universities can provide. So in that sense, yes. I mean, but what I've argued at those same times, the same people who are arguing for the economic necessity are arguing for the humanities as a necessity. So I think that's probably more of a public good argument, and maybe not so tied to specific times of hardship or luxury. I guess that's my short answer. I mean, I think you could also question sort of the whole free market idea of a university, whether it should be a free market entity or not, and get to some other questions that way. But that's my short answer to that question.
Okay. We might move on to the next question, which I'm going to direct to Joy. And that is so this question is noting that the relationship between the humanities and job readiness is not made as clear as it is for STEM or business subjects. So I guess meaning that if you do a business degree, you expect to go into business. If you do an arts degree, you can go into many different things, I guess. So this person's saying this likely affects intake into arts degrees, especially for students looking for guaranteed employment upon graduation. So how does one make the message clearer that in fact, for high school students, parents, teachers, that arts degrees are in fact a very lucrative degree to go into if you want a job when you graduate?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and it's the question all of us are asked on Open Day and at different times when we're talking about where our graduates go. Look, I think it's a really good question, and this is part of the problem, how we cut through with a clear message, because we can give examples, we can give statistics, but sometimes it's still very opaque. I think the way I see it is to say that arts graduates are to be found in so many industries and so many areas that it isn't just about one area. And I think that's its strength. There's enormous flexibility. So to give you an example, the banking sector, where you would expect economists and so on to be drawn, and there's a clear path there. In fact, the banking sector attracts a lot of arts graduates, and the leader of Westpac, Gail Kelly, was a classics graduate. This is the argument about the skill set. It's the argument about flexible skills. And what I say to parents is that lots of subjects come and go, lots of disciplines come and go, but the core skill set of a humanities graduate has survived through the centuries and will continue to survive. And that was my reference in my talk to going forward into the future in a very technological sort of society, with AI, etc. You cannot program critical thinking. You cannot program communication skills. And what the reports around AI keep saying is that the skill set that will survive actually is a skill set that the humanities graduates carry into jobs. So it is a question of focusing on the skill set and the variety of jobs. And there are lots of reports out there that highlight this, that an arts graduate can go into. And I know any of us can talk about, a personalised story about how our arts graduates, people we've taught, where they've gone. And they're in a whole multiple range of industries. And they've kept up. They've kept up with the technological progression that the society's kind of headed in because these skill sets are transferable.
So, yes, I what I have heard now also is that business or banks often look for philosophers, for example, people with philosophy degrees because of that critical thinking, and it is an arts degree is an adaptable degree, no matter what the economy might do. We have a question here which again draws inspiration from Michael's paper about how politics on both sides of the fence during the Second World War saw the humanities as having this dual role in protecting university freedom and also protecting us from narrowly conceived technological change, which of course was the crux of Michael's paper. So the question is, when, why and how does this broad consensus break down? So I guess I would add to that are we in a more fragile state now with the humanities in universities, where we no longer, say, have politicians using humanities, which I also include social sciences there actually, to say, this is what's needed for the well-being of society. But anyway, I'll keep the question to, is it more fragile now? When, why and how does this broad consensus break down? Michael, do you want to just, do you have thoughts about when it breaks down?
I started my research because of this, because I was working the humanities professionally, and I heard the crisis of the humanities, building as an issue. And I was curious where that started. And I found now references to that from the 19th century. So in one sense, the humanities have been in crisis for a while, or think they've been in crisis, or others do. But I do think that more recently, there is not, I don't think there's one sole idea of the university, but I think people would argue what is the idea of the university. And I think now I don't think that's as clear an argument now. I think universities are so much more complex, so much larger, have so much different funding models. This idea of the multiversity has changed things. And I think that makes the humanities especially fragile. And you can see this right now in this crisis. This is a crisis where the humanities, I don't hear the humanities mentioned in university support here where I'm in New Zealand right now, or in the United States. And we know what's going on in Australia. So I think humanities it feels a bit different. The humanities have really been pushed aside. I don't think they're doomed at all. I think Joy's arguments make perfect sense. But I think it's shocking to hear how the humanities have really been left out of the discussion now. So it does seem like something's different.
So Jane, can I just ask you from your perspective, sitting on the social sciences, what you think? Is there a sense in which the humanities is almost in this more fragile state as far as our politicians are concerned, and even perhaps within universities?
I think there's a lot of fragility in universities, which isn't directly answering your question, but I think part of that fragility is the insecure employment so many of our young academics, young scholars have had. And I am frightened that we're going to lose a whole generation or more of young scholars becoming older scholars. And I think that's really serious. And it does seem to be more fragile because of the government's attitude to what they still call STEM, and Joy and I would like to see as a more broader range of knowledge. So yes, I think there is a fragility at the moment.
Mm-hmm. And this is a question for Joy, that given that there should be a more harmonious, mutually beneficial relationship between the sciences and the humanities, so the sort of interdependency that you were talking about in your talk, the question is there any chance of the Academy of Science backing up the advocacy of the Academy of the Humanities and Academy of Social Sciences? So do you think politicians would be more likely to listen to advocacy from scientists?
Thank you. Yes. So just by way of answering that question, I should say here that Jane and I and the other academies form ACOLA, the Australian Council of Learned Academies, ACOLA, A-C-O-L-A, and that is actually where we collaborate with the other academies, the science, engineering and medical academies, very harmoniously and very productively. And I gave the example in my talk of the RIF exercise, which was a wonderful example of that collaboration and that cooperation. So we can point to examples where that happens. And by the way, that was initiated by the Academy of Science, that whole idea. So science is certainly not hostile to the academies that Jane and I represent. But I think they're selective, as we all are, with the battles they pick and where they put their energy. And this package has seen much more sort of intense engagement by the humanities and social science academies rather than the other academies. Now, you know, I'm not sure, I can't recall if ACOLA actually did put in a submission to this. ACOLA will put submissions to many government proposals. But it's a good point, and it's a really important one. And it is true that when the Academy of Science and the medical sciences collaborate with us, there is much more support, if you like. There is support from the government. That's very true. So there are examples where it happens. We always work closely with our colleagues there, but there are probably issues that will affect us more than the other academies. So I guess it's a matter of, you know, how we marshal that support.
So we're racing towards the end. There is a question here about, which follows on quite nicely, so about that connection between HASS, for those who don't know that acronym, it's Humanities and Social Sciences, and STEM, which I'm not even going to try to translate. I'm hopeless with acronyms. But the question is, you know, is there more than that perhaps science, humanities and social sciences can do to break down structural changes, which means they're often their own silos? I mean, I think of, say, when the University of Sydney was established, the sciences and the arts were in one faculty, and it was called the Faculty of Arts. And then you know, other faculties are created from about the 1880s onwards, which means more special, you know, specialties. So I guess it's that question of how does specialties, you know, sit alongside a generalist degree? Is there something that universities can do to make those sorts of conversations happen more easily? So would you like to have a little go?
I'll certainly have a go at that first. So Joy spoke about ACOLA, the Council of Learned Academies, and I think that's a very good example. There have been a whole lot of projects undertaken by ACOLA that involve all the academies and show how you bring those different aspects together, because most of our social problems don't fit neatly into disciplinary boxes. They're much broader than that. So I think the last report we've released is on artificial intelligence, and that's up on the ACOLA website now. So that's an example of how that is happening in solving real problems. The process, the RIF process, which was a response to COVID-19, was also an extremely good example of getting those different perspectives to work together, in that case around very, very specific questions that came from the politicians about COVID-related issues. So it's happening at that level. How do we make it happen at the university level? I think as universities have got bigger and more complex, they've become more siloed. And I think what we need to do is find ways of crossing the way we teach people. So I've always taught in economics, but also taught in medical or other health degree subjects as well. And it's quite clear when you do that how interesting those cross-fertilizations are. And in my experience, the students love it. So I think it behoves the university to find the way to make those sorts of things happen.
I'd like to just quickly, I'm very conscious that we're almost out of time, but I also know that Michael, of course, ran the programs at an Institute of Sciences, Arts. So I just wondered, Michael, if you had a quick comment, and then Joy, you can have a quick comment, and then we'll finish.
Well, yeah, I just very quickly, I guess that's what the Wisconsin Academy of Sciences, Arts, and Letters was founded in the 19th century, and the same question that these fields are becoming siloed. And the idea was to bring a group of people together to work interdisciplinary, whatever the word. But also these centers where I work, the Center for the Humanities, this is what centers do on campuses. Big campuses, centers can be amazing things because they don't have to focus solely on teaching and research. They can connect all these different groups on campuses. So I'm a big proponent of Centers for the Humanities, Centers for Social Sciences, SHARC at the University of Sydney, things like that can make a huge difference.
Just quickly, Julia. Just going back to Jane's point, look, there are areas where this is happening, but within universities, I think universities are way too fragile at the moment to be in an expansive and innovative mood.
On that sad note, I do want to thank my three guests today for a really illuminating analysis and also for your generosity in responding to all those questions which were coming in. In fact, there were so many coming in that I didn't even get to ask my prepared questions in case none came in. So that I think says a lot. It brings us to the end of this seminar. I also want to thank all of you out there in Zoom land who joined us today. You're the reason why we're doing this, so thank you. We reconvene on Wednesday the 14th of October at 4 p.m. for a panel discussion on higher education reform, where to now? And that will be with Tamsin Peach, Leo Renhau and Matthew Thomas will be sitting where I am. So until then, thank you and hope to see you soon.